Hi, everyone. Welcome tonight to Books and Books, one of my favorite places in the universe. And tonight, there's so many people that I really want to acknowledge and tell you about. Some of them are also my favorite people in the universe. But first, I'll start by thanking Books and Books and their staff. Mitchell Kaplan is not here tonight. He's out of town. So he asked me to please extend his apologies for not being able to join us. This is like the hardest working bunch of people that I know. There are two events here tonight in this room. There's an event across the way in the other room. And I'm just extremely happy to live in a city that has such a vibrant bookstore and a literary community, and I'm most happy to be a part of it. I want to tell you a little bit about the Big Read. The Miami Book Fair, as some of you know, is not just a 8-day festival in November. We also do events all year round, and we've been doing that for about 10, 12 years now. And the Big Read is one event that we do every year. We've been doing it since its inception 10 years ago. It's an NEA funded program that it happens all over the country, and it's really designed to bring people to the book, to get people reading again. The NEA puts out a list of books every year that communities across the country can choose from. And when I saw M Katz's book on it, I was so happy. Everyone on our staff was extremely happy because not only do we love the book, but we feel that it's a really important book, especially important in this community where so many Haitians have made their home since always, and most importantly also because Edwidge lives here in Miami, and she's actually in the audience tonight, so she doesn't have to speak, but we're gonna give her a round of applause because I am extremely grateful. Not only that she came here tonight, but that she has chosen and worked so hard to share her writing, her words, her imagination, her story, especially this story, with all of us around the world, but especially with our community. And I want to take the opportunity to thank everyone on our staff, Delia Lopez, who's our Director of Operations, Paola Fernandez, who works so hard to help me with everything. We've been like partners in literary crime for about 6-7 years now. And there's a lot of other people in our office that I would love to name, but Lisa Better, who's here and helps us raise the money that makes us be able to do these kinds of things. One of the great folks in our community who has believed in us enough to be able to trust us with funds is the Green Family Foundation, and they are one of the funders for this event tonight and for the entire Big Read. So a hearty thank you to Kimberly Green and her folks at the foundation for funding our Big Read. And I want to deeply thank my good friend Carl Just because not only do we do a lot of work together and spend a lot of time together, our families, our friends, etc., but tonight, Nadege Green, who's a reporter with WLRN, was going to be here with us to conduct a conversation with Jonathan Katz, but unfortunately she had an emergency and wasn't able to come. I found out at about 11:30 as I was driving. I just so happened to be driving to Carl's studio to talk about a project that we're working on for next Friday. And then I looked at him and I said, "Yes, you're gonna do it." And he said, "Oh my God, okay." And he stepped into the breach and has just done a wonderful job in the past 4 hours of boning up and getting ready to do this. So thank you so much, Carl, now and always. But I'm not going to bore you anymore. I'm going to introduce you to a very special person, another good friend of ours, and someone who's done a lot of work in this community. She's going to come and say a few words about Jonathan. Her name is Gypsy Metellus, and she is the co-founder and executive director of the Haitian Neighborhood Center, San-La, a one-stop neighborhood resource center that serves the Haitian and Haitian American population of South Florida. Gypsy's community involvement spans over 2 decades of leadership and service to the community through numerous boards. She currently serves on the Miami-Dade County Public Schools Diversity, Equity, and Excellence Advisory Committee, the Alliance for Human Services, the Alliance for Community-Based Care, and the Board of Trustees of Aventura Hospital. She's also a member of the Miami chapter of the International Women's Forum. She has a lot of other wonderful things that I could tell you about her, but I'm going to let her speak and tell you about tonight's event. I also want to let you know that Jonathan's books are available for sale, and we have some copies of Adwija's book, Brother, I'm Dying, that we're giving away for free as part of the Big Read. We're giving 1,000 books away throughout the month. So whenever, when we're done, just come and see Paula, and she'll give you a copy of Adwija's book to take home and read if you haven't, or to pass on to someone if you've already read it. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I know that you agree with me that we in Miami-Dade County are absolutely blessed to have an individual such as Carl Juste, the talented Carl Juste, photographer extraordinaire, and of course our very own Edwidge Danticat. I can't say enough about her. She knows we love her, and thank you for all that you do. Right? But this evening, I've got the greatest pleasure to introduce to you the speaker for tonight, and it's Jonathan Katz. So no one could make the case that there is a journalist out there, anywhere, who's better qualified to present the complex, tragic, compelling story of the Haiti earthquake, including its aftermath and the flawed recovery than Jonathan. His work has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, the Guardian, Foreign Policy, Political Magazine, the New Yorker Online, and many other publications. In his years as an award-winning correspondent and editor with Associated Press, Jonathan reported from Washington, Mexico City, Santo Domingo, New York, Jerusalem, the United Nations, and elsewhere. In January 2010, Katz was the only full-time American news correspondent stationed in Haiti. On January 12th, the deadliest earthquake in the history of the Western Hemisphere struck the island nation. In his award-winning first-hand account, the big truck that went by, how the world came to save Haiti and left behind a disaster, Katz takes readers inside the terror of that horrible day and the monumental, misbegotten rescue effort that left the world asking, how did so much generosity come to so little? Katz's work has been recognized with many prestigious awards, including the James Foley Medal of Courage in Journalism, both for his coverage of the Haiti earthquake and his investigation that revealed that United Nations peacekeepers caused and were covering up their role in a cholera epidemic that killed thousands more. So the big truck that went by has also received a number of awards, including the Overseas Press Club of America Cornelius Ryan Book Award, as a finalist of the Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction, as the Best Book of the Year by Kirkus, Slate, Christian Science Monitor, and Amazon. In one of the many glowing reviews of the big truck that went by, The Nation called the book riveting and required reading for anyone who wants to understand Haiti. Today, Katz is the writer in residence at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Center at Duke University, where he remains committed to the journalistic ideals of the pursuit and presentation of the truth. Please help me welcome Jonathan Katz.
One word. Wow.
That guy sounds pretty cool.
Wow. So this book is going to go right next to Quick Cock, right next to the comedians. And I'm going to be honest, full disclosure, there's no such thing as coincidence. Whatever plan there is in this universe, this was meant to happen. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for this wonderful book that I'm about to read. That I think we both lived the earthquake and its aftermath. So let's let's get to my first question.
Yes.
Tell me about the title.
The title. The one rude awakening that I had about the title right after the book came out was when I went to a bookstore and thought I'd be really sly and ask if they had the copy to, sort of hype it up a little bit pre-publication. And they said, The Big Truck That Went By, is that a children's book? It's like, oh, I didn't think of that. I thought of a bunch of other things, but I hadn't thought of that. So the title for me meant three major things. The thing that it meant most to me personally is as a name of the earthquake. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, one of the things I was interested in journalistically was just finding out what people were going to call this thing that had just happened. And some of the early names were just like Avant Matla, the event, or just Du Janvier, January 12th. But one of the first things that I heard, and I remember the first time I heard it was from a family. It was from actually a man named Asla Jean who lived, his family, they were from Marché Salomon in Port-au-Prince, but they were living on the Champ Mars, very close to where the collapsed National Palace was. And I asked him this question, is there a name for the earthquake yet? And he said that he was calling it, or the people were calling it, Gros Machine qui passe, the big truck that went by. To me, one of the reasons this resonated so much is because when I was sitting in my house in Pétionville on January 12th, the first thing that I thought when I was experiencing what I was going to find out seconds later was this devastating earthquake, I thought was a truck. Now, it was a little odd because it seemed to be coming from the opposite direction that the trucks normally pulled up in front of the house, but it was sort of telling that this is the sound I would have expected to hear, because so much of life in Haiti revolves around trucks and stuff on trucks. And the reason why is because years and years of desiccation of the state, of the interference of the Republic of NGOs, have weakened institutions in Haiti to the point that a lot of things that people who live in beautiful places like Miami take for granted, like the idea that electricity would be delivered over wires to your house, water would be delivered through pipes to your house. These are things that arrive on trucks. And those trucks rumble through on bad roads, past poor construction, and all day long, every day, for most people's lives, there would be the sound of this big truck coming, and then the house would shake. And so when the actual Gros Machine came, a lot of people, including me, thought that that's what we were experiencing. And so I wanted to evoke that, also knowing, of course, that there would be echoes of the idea of the aid response that came after.
Can you read an excerpt for us,
I can read an
please,
excerpt.
please?
I will do that.
Don't make me beg.
So I'm going to read, I'll just read a couple pages here from the second chapter, which is called Love Theme from Titanic. And the name of the chapter actually harkens to specific trucks, because the trucks that deliver water tend to play My Heart Will Go On, the love theme from Titanic. Anybody who's spent time in Port-au-Prince, yeah. You know the water truck's coming. And so the second chapter of the book, I'm not going to go all the way to the beginning, but it jumps back 60 million years to the formation of the Caribbean, and then in a couple of pages I managed through the magic of editing to get through very quickly through the rest of the history. So this is basically a summation of the history of this place, of Port-au-Prince in particular, and Haiti in general, leading up to January 12th, the last couple of decades. When Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier had been president, 4 in 5 Haitians had lived in the countryside. On the eve of the departure of Jean-Bertrand Aristide in 2004, nearly half the population lived in cities. A third of Haitians still in Haiti, nearly 3 million out of a population approaching 10 million, were trying to carve out space in and around Port-au-Prince. The pattern fit a global trend. In 2008, for the first time in human history, most people on Earth lived in urban areas. Social scientists said this could make for a positive development because cities generate jobs and income, deliver social services efficiently, and relieve pressure on the environment. Port-au-Prince is what happens when that all goes wrong. By the first decade of the 21st century, the capital was a place with little privacy or discretion. Sex, health crises, and arguments often took place in the open. Merchants jostled for space, pushing each other's market stalls into crowded streets. Travelers wore each other's sweat in the back of tap-taps. There was no protection from each other or the elements. Haiti's capital was a place so naked it had no skin. The shoreline slums grew, encroached on the national palace, and climbed the surrounding mountains. Because there was no regulatory body to oversee construction, the masses built shacks of crumbling sand-based concrete supported by a few strands of rusted steel wherever they could find space. After a few days of heavy rain, some would slide into oblivion. As the capital's population exploded, the state disappeared. The country's $1 billion budget in 2009 was smaller than that of Florida's Miami-Dade County, although Haiti had 4 times more people. Haiti, meanwhile, owed $1.8 billion in external debt. The little money that the state collected came mostly from duties on imports and exports, which businessmen had long since learned to avoid. UN soldiers were everywhere, but in their daily lives, Haitians could only rely on a tiny, underfunded national police force. Firemen showed up late to fires because their trucks didn't have gas. Doctors and nurses at the general hospital went months without pay. Horrendous traffic became a symbol and source of civic and national gridlock. Driving from one neighborhood to another, you might have spent hours stuck behind the swinging .50 caliber gun of a UN peacekeeper, watching a kid on a bike hitch a ride up the mountain on the bumper of a tap-tap, or a family of 4 maneuvering on an overtaxed motorcycle. Since the city didn't provide decent plumbing or electricity, exhaust-belching private trucks carried every basic good you can imagine. The water trucks played a music box version of My Heart Will Go On, the love theme from Titanic. You would hear their song, then the ground would rumble, and the walls and roof of your house would shake. The state's functions were supplanted but never replaced by an ad hoc system of foreign aid groups and NGOs. Saying they had learned their lesson from Duvalier-era kleptocracy, foreign governments resisted giving money or power to national authorities and funded NGOs and private contractors instead. There were anywhere from 3 to nearly 10,000 such aid groups in the country, 1 for every 1,000 Haitians. Diplomats, aid workers, and adventure-seeking misfits flocked to a city where the culture was fascinating and the pay was great. Many drew hazard bonuses, tax breaks, and free rent on top of a competitive salary. Their homes were cleaned by housekeepers whose going day rate was less than half the $10 we forked over for a box of Rice Krispies at the high-end Caribbean supermarket. It was an unpretty discrepancy, but few came to run wild or slum in luxury. Most foreigners arrived with good intentions to help the poorest people in the hemisphere, people who could never seem to catch a break. But the aid group's power to act without oversight or accountability was almost absolute. There was no way for Haitians to appeal an NGO decision, prosecute a bad UN soldier, or vote an unwanted USAID project out of a neighborhood. The Republic of Port-au-Prince had given way to a republic of NGOs. Haiti is a difficult place. No one, not even the rich, is fully insulated. You knew Christmas was near in Port-au-Prince because the kidnappings started. Gang members wanted to buy presents too. Their targets were usually Haitian, and when the families couldn't scrape together a ransom, sometimes even if they did, gangs often tortured and killed their captives. The foreigners and wealthy Haitians were more difficult, but also more valuable prey. Anyone who came to Haiti intending to help those poor people quickly learned that this place had no fewer, though also no more, murderers and thieves than any other. The police and courts were at best unreliable. Justice was more often handled by a machete-armed mob. Poverty was no baptism. Life was a trial by paper cuts. Even getting cash was a headache in a city with few reliable ATMs. And I was one of the lucky ones with cash to withdraw. Living on an island that produced little meant most things were imported and expensive. A gallon of gasoline hovered near $6 in a country where most people lived on $1 a day. But though nearly every Haitian faced hardship, most people I knew were kind and profoundly courteous, if also possessed of a wicked sense of humor. I could hardly ask for directions from a stranger on the street without being roped into a conversation about what a fine morning it was and who my family was, and then a long description of landmarks and turns that may or may not have led where I was trying to go. The hardships mounted, though. Days after I arrived in October 2007, a storm that would have barely slowed traffic in Miami killed a dozen people in a town north of Port-au-Prince in a flood caused by deforestation. A few weeks later, Tropical Storm Noel flooded the capital's largest slum, Cité Soleil. The following winter and spring, global food prices spiked, a devastating turn for people with no savings and little means of finding additional income. By April, food protests turned into riots that toppled the prime minister, leaving the country in an all-too-familiar power vacuum. And that fall, 4 consecutive storms ravaged the country, limping Tropical Storm Faye, the torrential Hurricane Gustav, Tropical Storm Hannah, and the Category 5 Hurricane Ike. In 2009, nature seemed to take a break. No hurricane hit. There were street protests and protesters were killed, but the country seemed to have settled into an uneasy lull. Bill Clinton became the UN Special Envoy for Haiti, pledging, in a slogan borrowed from his work after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, to build back better from the storms. That was already in currency before the earthquake. The stakes, everyone knew, were high. President Préval, ever more resented by a people whose lives were getting harder by the day, became fixated on the memory of the school collapse in Pétionville, haranguing foreign envoys to deliver metal classroom trailers to replace all three-story concrete schools he was convinced were on the brink of collapse. Diplomats wondered openly if he'd started drinking again. If only we had looked, we might have known. In May 2005, a 4.3 magnitude trembler had struck Port-au-Prince. The newspaper La Nouvelliste spent all of 57 words on the tremblement de terre, noting no damage and scant information from the interim government. A few days later, the U.S. Embassy sent a more detailed memo to Washington. The trembler was a reminder, the anonymous diplomat wrote, that a catastrophic disaster was possible in the capital. After 2 centuries of struggle, Haiti had a third of its population packed into an overcrowded city on a fault line. We lived, worked, and ate in poorly made buildings. There were no good public hospitals and few responders ready to help. There was nowhere for people to go. The last thing Haiti needs now, the memo concluded, is an earthquake.
Wow. Wow. So let's fast forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have this horrible earthquake. I mean, it's like on global proportions as far as loss of death and loss of property.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then we have half of the adult Americans donating to this cause, right? This international response, raising $10.3 billion. Did I say that right?
Mm-hmm.
Billion.
Yeah, but
What happened? Before you answer that question, I want to know, who are the cast of characters that was responsible for the dispensing of this kindness, global kindness? And tell us the protocol. I'm Red Cross. I'm going to build some new homes, right? Guide us through the process, please.
all 6 of the new homes you plan to build is across, right?
Well, they're nice homes.
Yeah. Oh, I've heard.
Yeah.
The money. So the money took on this mythical quality. People talked about the money so much, and the sums were so large compared to what you or I, or at least I don't know about you, are walking around with.
You and I. Okay.
Are walking around within our pocket on a daily basis. That there was sort of this repetition of the money, the billions, the billions, the billions, and it took on properties that it never could have had in the first place. So first of all, there's a lot of different tranches of money that we're talking about when we talk about the money. There were private donations that people made to organizations like the Red Cross, or to smaller NGOs, or to even individuals sometimes. There was the money that was pledged by national governments, such as the United States, at a donors conference that took place at the United Nations in March of 2010. And there was other bilateral money that sort of had always been kind of flowing and continued flowing after the earthquake, or at least continued being talked about after the earthquake. The thing is that there are different answers about all of this different money, about what happened. Part of it is that some of the money that was being talked about never existed. So
Wait. Rewind. Okay, wait.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get my head around this.
Yes.
Because I've been covering Haiti for about 25 years.
Yeah.
Tell me about the non-existing money. That's interesting. Go ahead.
So one of the things that happens is that when you're at a donors conference, and you're representing a national government, you make a pledge. I don't know if we're getting feedback off of the 2 mics.
Are we? I can move it a little bit.
All right, there we go. You come with a number that you're going to announce that we're going to give. So the United States number was $1.15 billion. But there wasn't any $1.15 billion that existed. This was purely theoretical at this point. This was a promise being made by the Obama administration because through the aegis of the State Department. But that money hadn't been approved by Congress yet. So this is money it doesn't exist yet. That money still has to be brought back home to the Capitol, in this case Washington, and negotiated out. Also, there were things that were considered money, that were talked about as money, that were never actually money and were never actually going to be handed over, such as debt relief. So of that $1.15 billion, and I forget the exact amount, several hundred million of that were money that, as far as the United States was concerned, Haiti owed us. And so we were now beneficently forgiving Haiti of that debt, which meant that Haiti was now free to spend several $100 million that it didn't have.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
So those are some examples of mythical money. The other thing is that the way that money tends to work, so you were asking about the Red Cross, because they're one of the big examples, because they raised $486 million, which is by far the most of any single organization that was working in Haiti after the earthquake. These organizations get the money, and they want to spend it. And governments give out money with the intention of being spent, but there are very, very harsh controls that are put on how it's spent. And the effect, and they know this is going to be the effect when they do this, is that the money doesn't end up actually going to the country that it is nominally being raised for. It kind of goes from one hand to another, from one very large pocket to another very large pocket. So when we're talking about, for instance, the humanitarian relief that was spent in Haiti in the wake of the earthquake, which I think was somewhere along the order of about $3 billion. 93% of that never left the donor countries, or the United Nations, or the Red Cross movement. 6% of it couldn't be traced at all. Which is very ironic, because one of the major reasons why the 93% stays where the 93% stays is because when we're not having this conversation, right? When we're not in Haiti, when we don't have to look people in the eye, or imagine looking people in the eye and say, we were supposed to be helping you, but really we just sort of pass money from one company in our country to another company in our country, the conversation is very different. People talk about corruption. People talk about waste. Americans vastly, vastly, vastly overestimate the amount of money that gets spent in our foreign aid budget. Right? There's always fun Jay Leno on the Man on the Street, or Chris Rock Man on the Street type surveys where they ask people, like, how much do you think is spent on the foreign aid budget? And people always say 25%, 50%, and it's really less than 1%. But even that less than 1%, there is very, very hard pressure from Congress, even before we had Congress as quite as reactionary as the one that we had now, to hold on to that money, to not actually give that money over to anybody else, in large part because money is power, and powerful people don't really like giving power away. And one of the reasons that they say that they're not going to do that is because of corruption, because of the idea that those people over there are dishonest and corrupt, and they're prone to steal the money. And yet, 6% of that $3 billion or so that is spent in humanitarian relief money can't even be traced, because the organizations that are holding on to this money for safekeeping won't even tell anybody what they spent it on. 1% went to the Haitian government.
Okay, wait, all right. Okay, all right, you got me there. Okay, so we have this money that's been promised, but it's kept, correct? Mm-hmm. All right.
It's spent, but it's just not, it's spent on different kinds of things. Sometimes it's spent on tarps and bags of rice, right? Things that people in Haiti can actually put their hands on, right, but that expire very quickly. They're sort of Band-Aids. Sometimes it's spent on things that are termed part of the relief effort, and are kind of part of the relief effort, but nobody in Haiti would ever see, like money for a hotel room in Florida that somebody stays in on their way down, or stays here to do coordination. And some of the things were just absurd. I talk about a number of them in the book. I found some real fun examples.
Can you give us one?
I can give you a couple. The Navy bought a bunch of cameras. I'm not clear on why this was. I forget the exact number. It was like thousands of dollars worth of cameras. It was actually at, it's not B&H, but it's the other one in New York, down the street from it. Adorama, yeah, that's it. And
they're gonna give me a couple. I would take
it. Yeah, they went to Adorama to buy the cameras. And then at some point, this was also the U.S. military. Actually, these three examples that I'm thinking of from the U.S. military, they bought a jungle gym. And they paid, this was the thing that offended me personally from a family that is of the never pay retail tradition. They paid, it's a hip crowd. They paid 3 times the list price for this jungle gym. I don't know. I don't know if they were getting like some other than like a slide that went up. I don't know what was going on. And then this was the one that just like made me laugh and still makes me laugh years later. Was at the end of its efforts in Haiti after the earthquake, the United States Coast Guard spent $11,000 on medals and ribbons to congratulate itself for the good job that it had done in Haiti after the earthquake. And every single penny of those $11,000, and I think I got it down to the decimal point in the book, you could look it up, the exact number, that counts as relief money. So when you look at the global total, every time somebody shows you the total amount of money that was spent, just remember $11,000 of that at least, because it was just one branch of service that was doing this, was for medals and ribbons to say, we did a good job, we did a good job, we did.
Let's talk about the local economy before the earthquake and the local economy after the earthquake, and then the impact it had on this money that's supposed to go for relief.
Right.
Let's talk about it a little bit.
Well, so one of the things that was really interesting. So first of all, like any country, there's sort of several economies that are all layered on top of each other in Haiti. The national economy, if you're talking about sort of the brunt of GDP, is in the hands of a very, very small group of people who basically control import-export cartels, you might call them, but really it's mainly imports. And they because so much of what is in Haiti depends entirely on imports from outside of the country. Some of this is I don't want to call it natural, but some of this is to be expected because it's an island, and there are certain things that you just can't get on an island. Islands are often importing things from other places.
Like rice.
Well,
I'm just asking questions.
Haiti used to grow its own rice. Haiti actually used to be a rice exporting nation, but some very bad food policy from the United States because of heavy subsidies that are paid to U.S. agricultural producers created, well, so 2 things happened. First of all, there was pressure put on the Haitian government to lower protective tariffs. And then this subsidized rice that ends up basically creating kind of a hidden tariff because this money is built into the cost because it can go low. That then comes and they say, okay, well, you're no longer able to protect yourself from imports, and here comes this very cheap stuff. And this has the tendency to turn people who were cereal producers, people who were rice growers themselves, into cereal consumers. And they leave their farms and they go to cities, and it's one of the things that led to the overconcentration of people in what ended up being the quake zone. Bill Clinton, by the way, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but Bill Clinton did take responsibility for having done this in testimony in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in March of 2010. But it was a very, very interesting, very Bill Clinton sort of thing to say. Because the man loves to apologize. It's worked for him over the course of his career. He always gets good numbers from that. And he actually sometimes over-apologizes, and this was a case where he actually was over-apologizing. These policies didn't begin under Bill Clinton. They began years before. I mean, really, the heavy reduction of tariffs, this big sort of free trade neoliberal regime, really starts in a major way under the Caribbean Basin Initiative under Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. Now, Bill Clinton certainly does perpetuate it. He certainly doesn't do anything to change it. And he's right when he says that it was good for some of my farmers in Arkansas. Right? He was absolutely right about that. But I've thought about that for a long time, the kind of bump that he got from saying that. And I think that part of what was going on at that moment, and this goes to your question about what the economy is, right? The economy of Haiti, as most people experience it, is as what are called, petits commerçants, right? Like very, very, very small business people, micro commerce, which often also depends on imports because it often depends on import chains of clothes or shoes or food or sometimes even electronics, whatever, that are coming in off of boats and they get unloaded. And middlemen, Madame Sarah, take them and divide them up, and the petits commerçants buy some, and then they go and they try to sell. And these supply chains were horribly disrupted by the earthquake. And one of the major things that people wanted, my friends in Haiti who are petits commerçants, the thing that they wanted most after the earthquake was just to restore their income so that they could just get their lives functioning again. One of the bitter ironies of the earthquake was it hit in January. And rent is often paid 6 months or a year at a time. And so many people had just paid their rent for either 6 months or for the year, when either the house that they were living in was destroyed or they no longer wanted to live in it because, I mean, I lived in a tent for 3 months and I didn't have to. I could have slept in a building the next day, but nobody wanted a roof over their head. And they just wanted something that could restart their incomes. And so we talk about sort of this, again, these mythical billions of dollars that are floating around, but none of it touches their hands to start their businesses so that they can redeem their lives. And one of the reasons is because there was a very specific economic vision that was brought to Haiti by the people who were in charge of, to answer your other question, dispersing where a lot of this money went. And one of those important people was Bill Clinton, who was the United Nations Special Envoy and was also the co-chairman of the Interim Haiti Recovery Commission, which was charged with dispersing several billion of the billions that were promised to New York. Also, Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, was an extremely important person in perpetuating this vision. And this vision was about production. It was about integrating Haiti into an international economic system that does something for us. And what that was restarting the assembly sector, especially the garment assembly sector. Because Haiti used to, in the 1970s or early 1980s, under Jean-Claude Duvalier, under Baby Doc, be a fairly major, or at the very least, important producer of cheaply assembled goods. There are a lot of famous examples. One of them is that at one point, every single baseball that was used in the United States major leagues was sewn in Haiti. People who are old enough remember whenever you would catch a baseball at a park, it said made in Haiti on it. I'm not that old, but I remember that.
But I am.
Yeah, there you go. That industry was basically destroyed over years and years of unrest because, especially if you look at the garment industry, it's a very fickle industry. It's all about narrow margins, paying people as little as possible to do as much work as you can get them to do so you can sell clothes as cheaply as possible. And when things start to go wrong, as they did in Haiti in terms of political upheaval, and when you had presidents in power like Jean-Bertrand Aristide and even René Préval that were not, in Aristide's case more than Préval, but neither of them were too fond of the garment industry as being a major pillar of the Haitian economy, there was a lot of pressure on those companies to leave. And they left. They left because they wanted to get away from the unrest. They left because there were other places that they could go and pay people even less to do tons of work. And it was more worth their time so that you and I could go to Target and buy cheap clothes. And the idea has been, the powerful people have never gotten this idea out of their heads, and I don't think that they ever will. And Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton in particular very, very much had this concept in mind. And they had it before the earthquake. Bill Clinton became the UN Special Envoy, like I read, in 2009, and the thing that he was there to do was to pitch this economic vision of transformation in Haiti, and it was built around this low-wage assembly sector.
And that's through his foundation?
No, well, the foundation ends up carrying water for projects like these, but that's a whole other thing. The Clintons are this incredible nexus of money and power and celebrity, of all these things that come together in all these different ways, and the foundation is only one small point. But the reason why I mention this as a tangent off a tangent off a tangent of the comments that he made about apologizing for those rice subsidies in March of 2010. And why would Bill Clinton apologize for something that wasn't entirely his fault, or maybe wasn't even primarily his fault? And why would he make such a big deal about it at that moment, 3 months after the earthquake? So I don't know for a fact, but this is my theory. Clinton at that moment was, the Clintons, both of them, and Bill Clinton in particular, at that moment were involved in high-level negotiations to build what ended up being the Caracol Industrial Park, which was a low-wage garment assembly park that's in the northern part of Haiti. That was paid for, by the way, with about $220 million of your tax money. The walls, the roads, the power plant, the shells, as they call them, the warehouses that the companies came in to fill. And it's very badly underperformed. It's created nowhere near the number of jobs that they might have expected. And we could talk about why in a second. But I think that what was going on at that moment was that Bill Clinton was signaling to people in the know, people who were involved in these conversations, I know the criticism. I'm speaking as Bill Clinton here, but I'm not going to do the accent. I know. I mean, I can if you want, but
Please do.
I know. Bill Clinton at that moment, I think, is saying, he's signaling, I know that you know what happened the last time we did this economic experiment. I know that you know that in the 1970s and the early 1980s, under Jean-Claude Duvalier, when we were putting all our eggs in the basket of low-wage assembly factories, that all it did was make money for companies overseas because the incentives that are given, they could do 100% repatriation of profits. They had to pay zero tax in Haiti. They were guaranteed that the workers would never unionize. They were guaranteed that the wages would stay low, because that's the goal. That's the goal if you're at a garment factory. That did not, even Baby Doc had to admit that it had not any real economic integration into the larger economy of Haiti. It didn't do anything to raise all ships. It didn't have this multiplicative growth that people were expecting. And people knew that. Any idiot could see it. Anybody who had been through this period knew this. But what Bill Clinton, I think, is saying when he says it was good that I apologize for these agricultural practices, and it was good for my rice farmers, it was good for my farmers in Arkansas, even though it destroyed the ability of Haitians to make a crop, is he's saying this time it's going to be different.
So what I think I'm hearing is that outside government, U.S. government force destroyed the very means by which people can make money, the very means that they can produce something they could consume themselves, which in turn put a pressure internally to import the very thing they could make.
Yes. I mean, I don't want to put too fine.
No, I'm just trying to understand it.
This is one thing I want to push back on. I don't want to put too fine a point on this because it is as bad to deny people in Haiti the agency of screwing up their own economy as it is to deny them agency in anything else. There were a lot of internal decisions that were made by a lot of people in Haiti. A lot of people who are key players in this, of course, are Haitian. Many of them in the elite. And the elite profited wildly from these garment factories, these assembly factories, and they were some of the ones who were pushing for it to happen. And they had the ear of people like Bill Clinton. When I talk about that nexus that the Clintons are at of power, the people who are accessing that nexus in Haiti tend to be Haitian, or they tend to be very wealthy Haitians. And there are a lot of other things that are going on as well, but it is important to understand the economic forces that are at play in this global system. And yeah, I mean, what you described is true. These things in the past contributed to the destruction of large and important sectors of the Haitian economy and have contributed to poverty that now some of the same people who implemented those ideas, or at the very least their ideological heirs, are now coming back to solve. And they are often trying to solve them by doing the exact same thing that created the problem in the first place.
Now, I'm going to say 3 dirty words. Everybody's here, right? NGO.
Yes.
Okay? Can you kind of explain how non-governmental organizations, how they fixed into this mess?
Yes. So NGOs don't just happen. I feel like this is a kind of like, let me tell you where NGOs come from.
Please.
When a daddy NGO and a mommy NGO love each other very much. So you can actually go back and look at the origins of the Republic of NGOs. There are documents about this. They were internal documents, and many of them are publicly available. You don't even have to file a FOIA to see them. There were memos that were going back and forth between government officials in the United States in particular. Obviously, I'm an American, and so that's where a lot of the reporting and the research that I've done is. And there are documents where they discuss specifically using what at that time were called private voluntary organizations, PVOs, but are the same thing. They're now called NGOs, to specifically try to undermine the government of Haiti. And at that time, maybe it wasn't such a bad idea to undermine the government of Haiti because the government of Haiti was a dictatorship. At the moment that they're writing these memos, Jean-Claude Duvalier is in charge. And the person who really will come up and talk about this in much more interest and length is my wife, who's currently in Port-au-Prince doing her research on the Duvalier era and the economy, and we'll have a much more complete history of this someday, in which she will come back and probably tell me that I'm screwing all of this up right now while I tell it to you. But nonetheless, it is important to understand that weakening the state was a feature, not a bug, of the NGOs. The point was, we, the United States government, are going to give money to these private organizations, and they're going to implement projects, they're going to provide health care, they're going to dig wells, they're going to pass out hygiene kits, they're going to do whatever it is, and they are going to specifically supplant functions of the state so that bit by bit the state gets weaker and weaker. At some point along the way, people lost the thread, and that ceased to be the explicit point, but it was still in the initial programming. And so even after the dictatorship falls in 1986 amid a popular revolt, this program continues, and it has continued up to this day. And so when NGOs, who do a lot of important work, and that's actually the problem, right? The problem, like if they were completely useless, then this wouldn't work because they wouldn't be able to replace anything. But when people from NGOs, when people from aid groups get up and say, as they often do, we're trying to work ourselves out of a job, it's actually impossible, because the way that NGOs function in a lot of countries in the world, including Haiti, they're coming in with so much money, they're coming in with so much power compared to the people that they're working among, that how could they ever possibly work themselves out of the job? They're the biggest kid on the block. And their focus is always on the next grant, the next grant, the next grant, making sure that the donors are happy, whether they're private donors or USAID. And no one who's, the word that they use for it in NGO speak is the beneficiary, right? But the other word for it is people. No one among the people actually gets to have a say. Nobody gets to have a vote. In fact, in the wake of the earthquake, when one of the NGOs, the International Organization for Migration, set up suggestion boxes where people who were living in a camp could just write down. These weren't like specific votes. They were just
Wait.
Yeah.
Wait, they're going to write something down.
Yes.
Let me get this right. What's
Yeah.
the illiteracy rate in Haiti?
Well, there's that too. But like people were writing down,
Okay.
people were writing down these requests, and actually it was actually interesting. People took them seriously, and were actually writing very specific material things that they needed. But that's not what IOM had envisioned. IOM had sort of envisioned this like nice thing where they would write, I don't know, thank you notes, or I don't know what they thought was going to happen. Like the fact that they had taken this step to actually have any semi kind of formal way to ask people who they were working for what they thought. Right. This merited like huge coverage in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and I think the Miami Herald, a couple of other places. Because it's such a remarkable difference from the way that NGOs normally work. Normally,
bizarre.
Yo fais ça yo vle que ja yo vle, right? They have no compunction about just doing whatever they want to do, because no one in Haiti, no mere beneficiary can keep an NGO from getting another grant. Only USAID can do that.
So now we have the NGOs, we have USAID, and let's talk about the third component, the Haitian government, or the lack of post-earthquake.
Yeah.
We have a parliament that is dysfunctional. You talk about Congress, but you have a parliament that's dysfunctional.
Yep.
You have infighting within certain parties.
Yep.
So can you talk about the political internal pressure, and how that added to the melee of just destruction?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. So I just got back from Port-au-Prince yesterday, and of course right now there's no president of Haiti. There's a temporary president, but for part of the time that I was down there, in the last couple weeks, there was no president at all, because the last president, Michel Martelly, stepped down on February 7th. The elections to replace him that he organized were fatally flawed, let's say. And there was a total vacuum. In fact, that's what he said when he folded up his sash in the ceremony in Port-au-Prince. He said, I hereby declare a presidential vacuum, or a power vacuum, as he handed it over, which he's a showman. But it was a good line. But it was true. And what was astounding about it is that like there was no difference. I mean, it was like everything was exactly the same. Because the state is so weak that how can you tell the difference? I mean, it's like if the government here completely failed, and public services ceased to be available, what would everybody do? They would go get a generator, they would go get a bunch of bottled water, they would get a cistern so they could collect their own water, and everybody already has that in Haiti because those things already exist, right? So because there's effectively no state. So in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, it's a different president in charge. It's René Préval. And there is a parliament, although that parliament is not completely filled because there were supposed to be elections that happened just after the earthquake that were canceled. That government has very little power, even in its own country. And one of the things that you have to understand about it is that there are only certain things that a central government can do and really needs to be expected to do. And I'm not saying this because I'm trying to give some kind of a pass to President Préval or the members of parliament. There was very little that they could have done. They're operating on a very small budget. They have very limited reach. But more importantly, a lot of the things that need to be done in the aftermath of a disaster and just managing people's daily lives on a regular basis aren't done by a central government. They're done by local governments. And in Haiti, the rot, the desiccation, the disintegration of governance has really kind of been from the bottom up. To the point that all you have left is this presidency, which is an entry-level job. Which I'm afraid it may now be in the United States as well. It never happened before, but we seem to be at least playing with the idea. But you have the presidency, and one of the reasons why, they're not all singers that used to dance on stage in a diaper before they were president, but very seldom do they have extensive government experience, because what government experience could you possibly have? You can't rise through the ranks in Haitian government by starting out on your local school board and then running for the city council and then becoming the mayor and then going to the governor's office and then going to be president, because those intermediary levels at the time of the earthquake barely existed, because anybody who lived Andeo, anybody who lived in the countryside knew that if you needed something done, the last person that you went to was like your local délégué or like the local mayor. You went to either the NGO or you petitioned the government in Port-au-Prince. After the earthquake, under Martelly, this went from tragedy to farce, because by not allowing elections to be held, even the post of mayor expired, and so the president himself personally appointed all the mayors all over the country. And so it's not giving them a pass to say, yes, they were absolutely dysfunctional. Yes, President Préval basically disappeared for days after the quake. I talk about in the book, I reveal where he was. He was actually riding around on the back of a motorcycle. You can read about it. But he was sort of surveying the damage on his own. But people in the capital didn't know where he was. He seemed to just be in shock. I mean, he just seemed to have no idea how to respond. But he also had no way to respond. Because the thing is that when you can't create the response on the day of a disaster.
Well, so who was running the show for 12 months after the earthquake? Who was running the show?
Well, this is the question: is which show are you talking about? Because if you're talking about the show as most people experienced it in their daily lives, the same people were running the show that was always running the show, which was themselves.
Okay.
So the vast majority of people who were saved from the rubble, I mean, the all but a vanishingly small number of people who were saved from the rubble were saved by neighbors. They were saved by family members. They were saved by friends. People. There's a lot of the criticism for the way that the aid response went on had to do with the tent camps and how long the tent camps lasted. But one thing to keep in mind is that those tent camps were a spontaneous idea of the people. What happened was everybody was out in the streets and people started collecting in areas, and wherever there was an open space, people would collect more and more. And yes, the NGOs and the international response really screwed up by sort of responding to this by delivering aid directly to these concentrations of people that then made even more people come in and the concentrations grow larger and larger and larger and larger. But nonetheless, these were cities. These were functioning places. And very quickly, I mean, 2-3 weeks after the earthquake, you had barber shops and movie theaters playing movies on DVDs and little restaurants that were operating within these places. So people were running their own show. The larger show was being run from high up above by a number of different people. Nobody held any more individual power than Bill Clinton did. Because he was the UN Special Envoy, he was the head of the commission that was determining how to spend money. He had the Clinton Foundation, he had the Clinton-Bush Haiti Fund. He had a number of different things going on. But even his power is just sort of one in this very, in this very literally chaotic, complex system.
Now, there was an idea that was floating around about kind of dispensing the government of Haiti and taking it out of Port-au-Prince and putting it in different areas of the country, so that if there's God forbid another earthquake happens, that you wouldn't have, the court system, the national police, all of them being under that pressure. What happened to that idea?
I've heard different things from different people. There was an idea maybe to like sort of either build up an existing city like Hinch, somewhere in the interior. Some people sort of termed it like a Haitian Brasilia. The idea that you would just sort of create a city from scratch to be the capital, and that eventually it would start pulling people off from Port-au-Prince. I've heard different things from different people. My understanding was, and I don't think I ever got to ask him about this myself, although we talked about lots of other things. But I think President Preval was somewhat against that idea, among other things, just because Port-au-Prince is Port-au-Prince. Port-au-Prince is the capital. It's been the capital since the beginning, and the idea of sort of giving up or abandoning Port-au-Prince to go somewhere else maybe seemed like it was anathema to him. There were other people in Haiti, Haitians, including people in positions of relative power and responsibility, who thought that it was a good idea. But ultimately, all of the talk about deconcentration that arose after the earthquake, and there had been plenty of conversations about this before the earthquake, fell sort of under its own weight of disorganization. And one of the prime examples of that is that after the earthquake, in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, one of the first things that people did was to leave the capital, to leave the quake zone. Haiti, for those of you who haven't spent time there, but maybe have spent time in other countries of similar economic means, is similar to a lot of places in which it's what geographers call a primate city, right? Where a city is like so large that it sort of is this controlling force. It's like a sun at the center of its own solar system. And sort of everybody lives in Port-au-Prince, but nobody's from Port-au-Prince, or a couple of people are from Port-au-Prince, but you'll meet people from Port-au-Prince all the time, but they're really Mun Jeremy, or they're really Mun Gonaïve, or whatever. And so people were going to Jeremy, they were going to Gonaïve, they were going to places that their families were from. We know this, by the way, because Digicel, speaking of companies that supplant functions of the state, was able to trace people based on their cell phones where they had gone, and they did a study afterward. And I think the number, it's in the book, was I think about 600,000 people left. And I can just tell you anecdotally, it definitely looked that way, because when you would be at the edges of the city, going to either other parts of the quake zone or out of the quake zone entirely, there were just long lines of people with things on their heads. There were people loading up the buses and tap-taps, and they were just going out full every day over and over and over again. But what ended up happening was that the aid that came in, the response that came in, didn't meet them where they were. They went back to places like Gonaïve, they went back to places like Hanch or Mirebalais, but there was nothing waiting for them there, except the same relative poverty that was even worse than Port-au-Prince that made Port-au-Prince an attractive place for them to move in the first place. And maybe a bunch of relatives who were like, oh, good, you're home. So nice to see you again. And so people left and they came back. And this is one of the signal failures, I think, of the response. Not necessarily because I have some great plan for how you could have gotten people to stay in Jeremy, although certainly if you had moved money there, if you'd moved institutional heft there, if there had been food waiting for people there instead of in the middle of the Champ Mars, maybe it would have encouraged more people to stay. But because the responders didn't even realize that this was happening until after it was over and everybody had come back. And so the thing is that this dream of decentralization, of making Port-au-Prince less of a primate city, right? Dismantling what Michel Roth-Triot called the Republic of Port-au-Prince, had gone, this was a dream long before the earthquake. And the earthquake was the absolute worst, most dastardly, awful kind of way that you could have thought of to accomplish this goal, but also in some ways would have been the most effective, right? I mean, what other message is there that this city is not safe, that there's too many people here, that we need to find some other way of organizing people than a disaster that kills basically 10% of the population. And people responded by leaving, but because the responders were so concentrated on the very, very narrow little things that they were concentrated on, including their own personal safety,
Right.
they were so afraid of the people around them that they were sort of staying cloistered in their little bases. And so they wouldn't have even been out at, Port Saigon or Port Leogan to see where people, that people were leaving. They just wouldn't have seen this with their own eyes. They weren't even aware that one of the major dreams and goals of development in Haiti for decades leading up to the earthquake had sort of come true on its own until it was too late to take advantage.
I mean, post earthquake Haiti, you had kidnappings, you had cholera, you had a dysfunctional parliament, you had all these bad things.
You didn't have
right?
cholera for 9 months, by the way. It wasn't until the UN brought it in September.
We're gonna get to that. We're gonna get to
Or in
that.
October,
So,
excuse me, 2010.
so is there? I'm gonna be very careful how I word this because I don't want nobody sending letters to the Miami Herald. And I'm not functioning as a Miami Herald reporter. I'm here as a friend and an admirer of your work, and I will read this one and be a bigger admirer. My question is, this concept called poverty porn, and this idea that people can come to Haiti, have a great story to tell, and live in drive nice cars, and then go home and say, "Oh, I was part of this great human endeavor." What is the takeaway? You wrote this book. What is the takeaway for us, for those who donated, for those who love the country, for those who continue to be involved with the country? What is the takeaway?
I think one of the important takeaways is that it's not about us. One of the reasons why poverty porn exists, and this definitely isn't my line, it might be yours, it might be Laurent Dubois, I can't remember who said this, but it's definitely not me, is that Haiti's chief export is redemption. That one of the major reasons that people from outside of Haiti go to Haiti is to sort of have this kind of rebaptism where you go to this incredibly difficult place and you find your shared humanity or whatever it is. By doing whatever it was that you did, you build an outhouse or a school, or you hand out Bibles, or you sing songs on guitar, or whatever it is, and then you come back, and you can read these stories all the time. I have a Google alert set up for Haiti, and I feel like a third of the hits that I always get on my Google alert, it's always a story about. And the smaller the town and the smaller the newspaper, the more I just feel bad about the way I feel reading these stories. But it's always the exact same story. And it's always about people who've come and they always say the exact same things. They say, oh, these people have nothing and yet they smile. How is that possible? How is it possible that people aren't just sobbing all the time and rending their clothes? I don't know what they think is happening. And they're inspired. And they go back home and they take that inspiration with them back home. And that's wonderful. And I do not, believe me, in this world, the way things are, taking inspiration away from anybody that's not my bag. I don't want to do that. Whatever makes you feel good, that's great. Hold on to that. But just understand that you going to Haiti or anybody going to Haiti and leaving and feeling better about themselves isn't the point. And the problem is that for years and years and years, there have been all these interventions that in some way, either small at some group or huge in terms of a government or resume burnishing at the level of a Bill or a Hillary Clinton, they're trying to get this thing out of it that they can show that they succeeded against adversity, they did this terrific thing, they were in this difficult place, and they made something out of it. And that has left Haiti with nothing. It's left it with negative, and it's been getting less and less and less over time. So I think that one of the most important takeaways is to understand that only Haitians can build Haiti. And that's not that's a line of, one of the things that makes it sound almost hollow is that it's a line of rhetoric almost that the NGOs use themselves. I mean, this has almost become like a sale line, a slogan in and of itself.
A refrain?
A refrain. But only, and it's not because there's anything particularly special about Haitians that they have this, it's just that that's where they happen to live, right? Only Louisvillians can rebuild Louisville if something happens to Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I grew up. But these are the people who live there. These are the people who are invested. These are the people whose lives are changed in one way or another by all the actions that take place. They have to be the ones that make the decisions. They have to be the ones that make the power. They have to be the ones that actually have their hands on the money, the real money, that in amounts that is large enough to actually be transformative. Because that's one of the other things I was going to say before, is that even these billions and billions of dollars, if you put it in comparison to, say, what the United States spends on war every day in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, and Uganda, and wherever else we're fighting wars this week, it pales in comparison, right? They're very small amounts of money, but they could be transformative in some ways if they can get into the hands of people whose lives actually are going to be affected by this and can actually make the decisions to direct themselves. So I think that it's important to understand that the world is never going to come to save Haiti. That's not the point. What the world can do is the world can step back, the world can stop screwing over Haiti, and the world can try to support Haiti and Haitians where it can, so that Haitians can build the kind of country that they want. And I have no idea what kind of country that's going to be. And they may elect Donald Trump president. But if they do, that's their choice. And maybe a better choice, because they don't have nuclear weapons, than us electing him president. But I think that's the important thing. I think it's to be more humble and to understand that it's not to go there and make a nice story about yourself, or even as a journalist to go and make a nice story about other people, but really to cede sovereignty and responsibility back to and accountability back to the people who deserve it, who are the people who actually live in the country.
I think that's a great takeaway. Being Haitian, and again, I think we live parallel lives. We get to see Haiti from the inside, and then we get to leave and see it again from the outside. But one thing I've always bothered me, bothered me about Haiti, is that I always felt when I returned it would be better. Can you talk about that when you go back? I mean, this little things are better. The airport is nice. They have another road that goes to Pitchonville. You make the left side or the right, taking John Brown. I mean, that's
the one that goes straight to Mickey's house?
Yeah, straight to Mickey's house. Yeah. But for every step forward, it's like 50 steps back.
Yeah.
And I think the earthquake really exemplified that.
Yeah.
And my last question, because I don't want to take up too much more time.
We can take audience questions after.
Yeah, my last question is that most of the rubble is gone, most of the tents are gone, but the amputees are still with us. The event still walks and breathes in Haiti. How the hell are we going to get past this? And I say we, because I'm still Haitian. How are we going to get past this? How are we going to empower ourselves so we don't have to wait for the next big savior? What is the one thing that we need to do immediately to put us in that path?
Oh man, I wish there were one thing. And then we could just do that. You're right. You're right that the memory of the disaster in the places that experienced the disaster in Port-au-Prince and Léogâne and Jacmel, and other places that experienced the disaster it's still palpable. It's still with them. I mean, I think about it all the time, way more than I want to. But at the same time, people have. I mean, the one thing that is an abundant resource everywhere is time. And time continues to press forward relentlessly, and the earthquake keeps seeping farther and farther into the past. And when people have struggles, when you go to bed at night not being absolutely sure where you're going to get food to feed your children in the morning, it becomes easier to start losing your grip a little bit on history, although I think that things like that still end up creeping in on the margins. I mean, you know, the past is always haunting everywhere, right? But I don't think that for the generation that went through the earthquake, that the earthquake will ever go away, nor should it. I mean, no, you know, in a lot of ways, you know, these memories are all we have, and they're very valuable. And I don't want to, as much as I would love to not have the bad thoughts that I have when I think about the earthquake, I don't want anybody to take that memory away from me. The goal is to be able to process that and to assimilate that and to put it into a world where the memory would be, man, do you remember how bad things used to be, as opposed to
how they still are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that you know, you know, people my age, when they become Haitian grandparents, can lecture their grandchildren. You have no idea how hard it was. No idea. And in order to do that, you have to allow power, and power in the form of money, to go back to people so that they can build the kind of future that they want. Because I can't pick the kind of future that Haiti wants, because I'm not Haitian and it's not up to me. And I would probably design something really weird, but there would be a lot more delis. But I think that they will learn to love pastrami. I promise you. No, but it's up to them to come up to that. What we need to do, you know, in terms of people who are outside of Haiti, is to step back and allow that future to develop itself without us standing on its throat.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to take some questions out from the audience, right? And so let's take some questions. I'm going to bring you the mic, okay? Hold up. No, I'll come to you. It's all right. Please state your name.
Hi, I'm Dina. I was wondering about the writing.
Mm-hmm.
Is the book a collection of your writing from the publications mentioned, or did you do additional reporting, and how did you write differently for a book as opposed to articles in newspapers and such?
Those are all very good questions. So first of all, no, it is a book. it is a book that was created solely as a book. None of the material that's in it was ever anywhere previous. Even if I wanted to, I don't think the Associated Press would have let me collect my articles, but frankly, I wouldn't have wanted to, because the book is a very different kind of writing than the kind that I was doing when I was an AP correspondent. AP articles tend to be, or for newspapers or for wire services, they tend to be somewhat formulaic. Oftentimes they're repetitive because you're going over the same ground over and over again. Very impersonal and often sort of written with this kind of authoritative voice from nowhere, right? And the book is anything but that. I put myself in the book. I put my wife in the book, although she wasn't my wife when I put her in the book, but maybe it helped make her my wife. I'm not really sure. Apparently it didn't hurt. And part of the reason I did that was because I wanted to present to the reader who was telling the story, to make it clear that it was somebody who was coming in with my own biases and my own opinions and my own relationship as an outsider who went through the things that I went through, and then you can kind of go from there and evaluate. It is the ground that is covered in it. It basically, for the most part, other than the chapter that jumps back 60 million years, covers mostly things that happened in 2010, the year of the earthquake, and for the 12 months that followed. But for me, as a writing process, it was an opportunity for me to re-examine the things that I went through, try to do some processing on my own, and to draw conclusions and just have bigger thoughts than was possible on the daily grind of trying to produce the amount of copy that you were expected to produce when you're a correspondent of the Associated Press.
We have a second question over here, please.
Yes, just, Americans live in Haiti, Haitians live in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
How can one step back if we're there and we're here? And then you mentioned just a few steps forward, but 50 steps back. So it seems to be a lot of steps back. I mean, I come just living in Haiti and seeing the steps forward over, let's say, the last year and a half that I've been there, and then, but I don't think of 50 steps back. So I just to give a little more detail about what you mean by that, and then these Google alerts. I mean, who writes the Google alerts? I mean, you know, there's the language, because Creole, there's French, there's journalism there. It's not translated. I mean, in an ideal world, journalism will be instantly translated and made available as, you know, let's say, New York Times does a piece, translates it from French into English and publishes it, and that creates an impact about women in the Arab world and how they're seen, for example. A piece that struck my recently. So I'm just wondering about how, I mean, just talking about ideal situations where Google Alerts can be available, where you see also, Americans also see what the Haitian journalists are reporting, or is it that Americans need to learn French and Creole to a point where they can participate even more deeply in Haiti? I mean,
well, I think it's very important for
Thanks.
us to. Thank you for the questions. I think it's very important for us to be able to hear more stories. If we're interested in Haiti, for instance, the people who need to be telling stories are Haitian. And there needs to be more of an opportunity to hear directly from people. One of the things that I was sort of wrestling with when I set out to write the book was I felt like I had a lot to say. I felt like I had a lot of insight. I felt like my direct experience made it valuable, but then it was still just like one more white guy writing another book about Haiti. And I wasn't entirely sure the world needed that. But I at the same time, I hope, or I at least like to think that the existence of my book is not, filling a hole that would otherwise be filled by people in Haiti being able to tell their own stories. My hope is that I love it when people read The Big Truck, and I hope that people continue to do so. But I also think that it's incredibly important, and that's true for all the articles that you're reading on Google Alerts. I mean, it's wonderful. Everybody should be able to throw something in the mix. But I think that I think that one thing that is often lacking from the conversation are the stories and the ideas and the points of view of the people who are living this experience day in, day out in Haiti itself. And I think we need to be more attuned to that fact. And you're right, maybe technology is the answer. Maybe instantaneous translation of Creole, which is not that far off. Maybe that's something that's going to change it.
To address one step forward and 50 steps back, it's not only done by Haitians, but it's done by the situation which Haitians have to live. You have a free election of Aristide, and where are we from now? We have no president. The judicial system is in shambles. So in order, it's great to build a nice new hotel, which I'm cool with, but why don't you built me a good court system, so if I have any grievance with someone, if someone kidnaps me, I could go to that person and say he did it, and know that person will serve time. So those are the steps that I'm talking about that need to keep moving forward. And when you have these pressures that we were talking about earlier, they become distractions into achieving those major steps which are more important because they serve Haitians. They don't serve tourists. They don't serve NGOs, they serve Haitians. Yes, let me take, I have one question over here, please.
So Jonathan, based on your perspective, what would you say is Haiti's saving grace?
What do you mean by saving grace?
What is it that Haiti has as an asset that's leverageable to sort of propel it forward?
I mean, Haiti has survived. I mean, Haiti is still around, which is pretty incredible considering everything that it's gone through, and the people have gone through in their own individual lives. And I'm not trying to essentialize or exceptionalize, resilience or this idea that that there's some kind of superhuman quality to it, because I don't think there is. I think that people are reacting the way that humans often do under pressure. But it's incredible, and part of what it means is that people are able to do the work, and people are able to put up with incredibly difficult material conditions that can exist during transitional periods in order to build something new. And I don't know if that will prove to be a saving grace, but it's certainly an avenue that can be traveled. There are some societies. If you compare the situation in Haiti, things can often feel quite hopeless. But you compare the situation in Haiti to other countries, like for instance Syria, right, where you had a country that was, talk about imposition from the West. I mean, its borders were just drawn by Mr. Pico and Mr. Sykes, and people who had nothing to do with one another and wanted to have nothing to do with one another were forced together into a single polity ruled by this one family that was willing to do anything, including murdering entire towns full of people, which was already happening years in the past, in order to preserve their rule. And when a moment of transition came, when a challenge came to the Assad regime, where people stood up and said, we want things to be different, everything fell apart in this incredibly deadly way, where people have basically committed an earthquake on themselves in Syria. When you look at the numbers, they're just absolutely astounding. And that doesn't exist in Haiti. That's good. You don't have this incredible ethnic tension. You don't have people who are still committed to the memory of the Kingdom of Haiti in the north and the Republic of Haiti in the south that are just waiting for another opportunity to reignite the civil war. And I think that's a good thing. I think it means that there's a potential that the country can go through a transitional period where it does acquire money and it does acquire power that it can leverage in ways to make a better future for itself that doesn't have to go through that kind of level of strife. But nonetheless, it's going to be incredibly difficult because building the institutions that need to be built there, essentially from scratch, is no easy task, much less in a country where more than 10 million people currently live. And so none of this stuff is going to be a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it does create circumstances that might be more propitious than they could be in other places.
We're going to take one more question and one side. Come on, we got to keep it even. All right, this gentleman here with a beautiful scarf. Go ahead.
I love the way from time to time you interjected in your lecture from the U.S. And I like to do a parallel of what you said regarding the NGO, the money they received. Mm-hmm. And what comes to my mind is the stadium, the Florida Marlins Stadium. The billionaire owner received $1 billion to get a brand new stadium and would continue to receive that. And while here you have Skid Row in front of Jackson that reached now to 7th Avenue. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, how come we have money to give to billionaires and we're not helping the poor people here? And it's the same thing. The money is going to NGOs, and sometimes I wonder, do they have any future plans? What are they doing? Just surviving? They're just creating jobs? Because it seems that when there are problems, that's all we do is create jobs for foreigners, because those jobs are not being given to Haitians, nationals.
That's a good question. I was born in Queens, not Brooklyn, but I could still do the millionaires and the billionaires thing if you want me to. But in all seriousness, those conversations about inequality and the fact that they exist everywhere are incredibly important. It's essential to understand that Haiti is an island, but it's not on an asteroid. It's not just floating somewhere out in the universe. It is part of our world, and these structures and these inequalities and these decisions that we make here are part and parcel of what's going on there. And it is true that changing those kinds of gross inequalities in our own society, first of all, would be good for its own benefit, but I think could also possibly have multiplicative effects in terms of foreign policy and the way that we deal with other countries. And if you see some sort of fundamental remaking of the world economy in which people who are being left out, more and more of the money and the conversations of power are able to claim more for themselves, I think that you could see a fundamental remaking of the kind of world economy that creates, in this specific instance, the economy in Haiti. I have friends who would have said that a lot more clearly, just in terms of saying, like, we need to overthrow capitalism in order to solve the problems at Haiti. I'm not making that claim. Because as I think Syria is a good example, things can get pretty messy when you start just destroying institutions, even if some of those institutions are bad. But nonetheless, I think we do need to recognize the ways in which the institutions that we live inside and institutions that act in our own communities and that we can in some ways benefit from, and we can also sometimes be hurt by, are part of this system that has created the Haiti that exists in 2016, and I hope that conversations about Haiti and drawing attention to just the incredible and just mind-numbing inequality that exists within Haiti and then from the outside world compared to Haiti can also help expand and maybe make a safer space for us to have conversations about the inequality that exists here.
Jonathan, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to Books and Books. Thank you to Green Foundation, the Big Read. And let's continue talking. Let's continue talking. I don't think anyone has the pill, the cure, but I think that together, I think we could solve many of Haiti's problems, but together. And thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, John. And thank you all for coming again. And if you want a copy of Edwige's book, Paola has them in the back. And Jonathan's books are for sale up front, and he'll be signing here if you purchase a book and you want to come back. And if for whatever reason we run out of Edwige's books, then just come see me and I'll get your info and I'll put it in the mail for you. Okay? They're also available for sale if you want to purchase one. Thank you.
I'm actually